A life that seemed so ordinary on the surface hid a darkness so unimaginable that even today investigators struggle to comprehend how it quietly thrived behind one apartment door. How can a man move through the world unnoticed while carrying secrets that would terrify an entire nation? What twisted path shaped someone capable of such cold calculation, such relentless hunger for control? In this story, you will uncover not only what Jeffrey Dahmer did, but why his world spiraled into one of the most disturbing chronicles in American crime. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer entered the world in early June of 1960 in the calm suburbs of West Dallas, Wisconsin. Nothing about his infancy signaled the storm that would one day engulf his name. Yet the foundations of that storm were already forming, stone by stone, inside a home that looked peaceful from the outside, but carried a quiet fracture beneath its walls. His father, Lionel, a stern yet well-intentioned chemistry student, was consumed by academic pressure. His mother, Joyce, struggled with severe anxiety, depression, and dependency on prescription medications. The environment was tense, unpredictable, and chronically unstable. While neighbors saw an average Midwestern family, Jeffrey felt the constant vibration of conflict, a tension that made him retreat inward long before he learned how to speak his feelings aloud. As a small child, he was not overtly aggressive nor outwardly troubled. Instead, he was unusually quiet, observing the world with a distant, almost disconnected gaze. When he was barely 4 years old, a minor surgery to correct a double hernia left him immobilized for weeks, in pain and terrified. The fear of being touched, the fear of losing control, the obsession with the vulnerability of the human body, these ideas would echo through the darkest chapters of his adult life. But in that moment, he was only a trembling child trying to make sense of a fear that felt larger than him. In the following years, Jeffrey's fascination shifted toward something far more alarming. While other boys played ball or chased each other in backyards, Jeffrey became fixated on the stillness of dead animals. He would find roadkill, inspect the remains, and study the way bones fit together like hidden mechanical puzzles. Lionel, unaware of what these collections truly meant, tried to encourage his son's budding scientific curiosity, even showing him how to bleach bones properly. To a father, it felt like nurturing a potential academic interest. To Jeffrey, it was a new way of understanding life and death, one that required no emotions, only curiosity. By the time he entered elementary school, the signs of emotional detachment were becoming more pronounced. Jeffrey rarely spoke unless spoken to. He avoided eye contact, kept to himself, and seemed to drift through the days without direction. Teachers noted the lack of engagement, the way he faded into the background, as if he were trying to erase himself from the room. But because he was not disruptive, and because he came from a family that appeared stable enough, no one suspected the turmoil brewing inside him. Everything intensified when the family relocated to Doylestown, Ohio. Jeffrey, now entering adolescence, felt uprooted once more. His sense of isolation deepened, and for the first time, he became aware of his own desires, confusing, frightening impulses tied to dominance and fantasy. His classmates viewed him as a class clown in the most unusual sense. He would mimic seizures, bark randomly, or perform bizarre pranks that earned him the nickname, "Doing a Dahmer." Many laughed, never realizing that these outbursts were not jokes, but the early signs of a deteriorating emotional core. The tension within his home reached a breaking point. Joyce's mental health worsened, fights between his parents escalated, and the atmosphere grew more toxic by the day. Jeffrey watched as the foundation of his family collapsed, leaving him stranded between two parents, consumed by their own suffering. By high school, he had turned heavily to alcohol, drinking before classes, hiding bottles in his locker, arriving intoxicated to school events. It was his way of numbing the rising storm, the fantasies he did not understand and could not control. Teachers noticed his decline, but the quiet, distant boy had simply become a quiet, drunk teenager, someone easy to overlook in a crowded hallway. The final fracture came in his late teens. His parents' marriage imploded completely. Arguments became shouting matches. Cabinets slammed, doors shook, and Jeffrey remained a silent witness to the chaos. When the divorce was finalized, something inside him snapped. His mother left the home, taking his younger brother with her, leaving Jeffrey alone with Lionel, who, shortly after, moved out to start his life anew with his partner. Without intending harm, both parents abandoned him in a house filled with silence and emptiness. There were no rules, no supervision, no emotional anchor. He was 8 years old, and he was completely alone. What followed in the summer of 1978 was the moment when Jeffrey Dahmer crossed a line from which he would never return. The fantasies that had once been contained in his mind were now free to devour him. The loneliness, the desire for control, the craving to possess another human being entirely, these impulses fused into a singular, catastrophic decision. It happened when he encountered a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. A chance meeting on a rural road. A conversation that seemed harmless. A teenager looking for a ride to a concert. A lonely young man desperate for company. The invitation to Jeffrey's home felt innocent enough. Drinks, music, small talk, nothing suspicious. Until Stephen tried to leave. At that moment, Jeffrey felt the old terror of abandonment roaring back, stronger than ever. In an instant driven by panic and obsession, Jeffrey struck Hicks with a dumbbell, ending his life. It was brutal, impulsive, and horrifying. But the worst part was not the act itself, it was the reaction. Instead of collapsing in guilt or rushing for help, Jeffrey felt an eerie calm settle over him. He methodically hid the body, dismembered it, and disposed of the remains with a coldness that would later send shockwaves through investigators. It was the beginning, the turning point, the irreversible step into a world where death became intertwined with desire, control became addiction, and silence became the only witness. And from that moment on, nothing in Jeffrey Dahmer's life or the lives of those he encountered would ever be the same. Before we continue, make sure you follow and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter. And tell me, what do you think truly pushed him over the edge? The loneliness, the broken home, or something darker already inside him? The aftermath of that first killing did not unfold the way most people imagine. There was no frantic escape, no shaking hands, no sleepless nights. Instead, Jeffrey Dahmer walked through the following days with a strange emotional numbness, a quiet acceptance that frightened even him. He attended meals with his father, mowed the lawn, and moved through daily routines as though nothing had happened. The world kept spinning, and Jeffrey felt himself blending back into it with disturbing ease. The truth was that the act itself had not filled him with regret. It had filled a void he never knew how to silence. And that realization, more than the murder, was the true point of no return. But life was about to drag him back into structure. Lionel, unaware of the monstrous secret buried in the backyard, insisted Jeffrey enlist in the army. It was a last attempt to straighten him out, to force discipline into a drifting young man whose drinking had spiraled beyond control. In late 1978, Jeffrey boarded a bus and entered basic training, a place designed to break men down and build them up again. But what it built inside him was something far more dangerous: suppression. At first, he managed to blend in. He followed instructions, appeared compliant, and even showed promise with medical training. He was assigned as a combat medic in Baumholder, West Germany. The irony was chilling. A man who had taken a life now held the responsibility of saving them. But the structure of military life could not contain what was growing inside him. The alcoholism worsened. The fantasies sharpened. The loneliness grew heavier in a foreign country where he had no emotional anchor. His performance declined so rapidly that his superiors eventually discharged him, not dishonorably, but simply because he was unfit for service. They gave him a plane ticket and sent him back into the world. He returned to the United States with nowhere to go. His mother had moved across the country. His father refused to let him drift endlessly and insisted Jeffrey stay with his grandmother in West Allis. She was warm, devout, the type of woman who believed kindness could mend anything. Her home became Jeffrey's temporary refuge, but it also became the stage where his darkness evolved into something more calculated. At first, he tried to live normally. He attended church with her, helped with chores, and even found a job at a chocolate factory. But the calm was superficial. The fantasies he had managed to suppress during his army years returned stronger, more vivid, and more demanding. They no longer whispered. They shouted. He began frequenting local bars and bathhouses, looking for men he could bring home not for companionship, but for control. He drugged several men, paralyzing them temporarily, seeking absolute power over their stillness. These were rehearsals, preparations, experiments for the acts he was slowly moving toward. When the bathhouses banned him for drugging patrons, Jeffrey realized something crucial. His impulses would no longer fit inside the boundaries of ordinary life. The escalation was inevitable. In late 1987, Jeffrey met a young man named Stephen Twomey. They shared drinks, talked casually, and ended up in a hotel room. For years afterward, Jeffrey claimed he had no memory of the killing that followed. He insisted he woke to find Stephen lifeless beside him. His chest caved in from a violent assault. Whether this amnesia was truth or self-delusion, investigators would never know. What mattered was Jeffrey's reaction. Once again, instead of breaking down or calling the police, he moved with chilling practicality. He purchased a large suitcase, transported the body back to his grandmother's basement, and methodically dismembered it. The transformation from impulsive killer to methodical predator was now complete. Jeffrey discovered something darkly significant. The act of killing fed his desire for possession, but the aftermath, the stillness, the ritual, the quiet control over a lifeless body was what he craved most. He wanted a companion who could never leave, never argue, never reject him. A form of obedience no living person could provide. In the months that followed, the cravings deepened into compulsion. His grandmother, who loved him unconditionally, began noticing unusual sights and smells. Strange hours, locked doors, late-night excursions. She confronted him gently, believing he was slipping back into alcoholism. She had no idea she was sharing a home with a predator, evolving in silence, perfecting his rituals behind her basement door. By early 1988, Jeffrey's behavior had become too erratic even for her. Lionel decided Jeffrey needed his own place, believing independence might steady him. Instead, it freed him. Once he moved into a new apartment, Jeffrey no longer had to hide his impulses. The privacy was intoxicating. The isolation became a playground for the darkest corners of his imagination. And the city of Milwaukee, unaware of the storm gathering behind his apartment door, would soon become the hunting ground for a man whose desires had grown into a hunger impossible to satisfy. That hunger found its next victim in a young man named James Dockstader. Jeffrey lured him with promises of money for photographs, an offer crafted to seem harmless. Once inside, the pattern repeated itself, drugging, overpowering, claiming. The act was no longer hesitant or clumsy. It was becoming ritualized. But Jeffrey still made mistakes. His grandmother's home had been a buffer against his impulses, spiraling out of control too quickly. On his own, he was accelerating without restraint. When neighbors complained about strange smells, Jeffrey improvised excuses, blaming spoiled meat or a broken refrigerator. When voices or clattering were heard at odd hours, he brushed it off as dropping weights or doing late-night cleaning. No one suspected the truth. Not yet. Over the next couple of years, the killings continued with a chilling rhythm. Each victim represented a refinement in Jeffrey's process. He learned which combinations of drugs kept someone conscious but compliant. He learned how to dismember without leaving evidence. He learned how to maintain a facade stable enough to avoid suspicion, even as the chaos inside him grew more violent. He was no longer a lonely young man acting out of desperation. He had become a predator, sculpting his desires into method. The turning point arrived in 1991 when he moved into apartment number 213 at the Oxford Apartments, a private space isolated with neighbors who minded their own business. It was here that Jeffrey Dahmer would fully unleash the version of himself he had been suppressing for years. It was here that his descent would accelerate into the territory that would later horrify the world. The experiments, the photographs, the rituals he believed would finally give him the perfect, obedient companion. It was here that the nightmare would truly begin. Before we move to the next part, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the unfolding of the darkest chapter in this story. And tell me, do you think Dahmer was already destined to become a predator? Or was it his environment that carved the monster he became? When Jeffrey Dahmer stepped into apartment number 213 at the Oxford Apartments in early 1991, he crossed into a new psychological territory. The moment he turned the key and opened the door to that compact, dimly lit space, he felt something shift inside him, a dangerous fusion of freedom, secrecy, and opportunity. This was no longer just a living space. It was a laboratory, a sanctuary, and ultimately a mausoleum built to serve a hunger that had spiraled far beyond compulsion. The apartment was small, barely large enough to contain a handful of modest furniture pieces. But Jeffrey saw potential in every corner. The darkness allowed his fantasies to breathe. The lack of prying eyes coaxed his rituals into full bloom. Here, he could experiment without interruption, act without supervision, and build the world he imagined, one where control, silence, and unwavering obedience existed under his full command. The killings that followed were not impulsive acts driven by panic or opportunity. They were engineered, planned, motivated by a vision that grew more delusional and absolute with each passing day. Jeffrey's goal was no longer just to possess the lifeless. He was now chasing the impossible, the creation of a permanent, zombie-like companion, someone who would exist completely under his control, suspended between life and death, conscious yet captive. The victims who entered apartment number 213 in those months had no idea they were stepping into the epicenter of one of the darkest criminal spirals in American history. The first to enter Jeffrey's new domain was a young man named Curtis Straughter. He accepted Jeffrey's offer of money for photographs, believing it was a safe way to earn quick cash. But once inside the apartment, the pattern unfolded with relentless precision: drugging, overpowering, claiming, dismembering. In these acts, Jeffrey found what he believed to be purpose, ritual, and stability. But each killing only deepened the abyss he was spiraling into. The next victims, like Errol Lindsay, were chosen with unsettling logic. Lindsay was different. He was not homeless, not estranged from family, not isolated from the world. He was well-dressed, confident, and grounded. Jeffrey selected him not for vulnerability, but for something deeper: the challenge of transforming someone who embodied life into something still, compliant, and permanent. Lindsay's murder became one of the first attempts in Jeffrey's experiments. He drilled into the skull, attempting to create what he later called a living doll, a companion who would exist without thought, without will, without the ability to leave. The attempt failed, as they all eventually did, but this marked the moment when Jeffrey's killings transformed from acts of violence into twisted attempts at biomedical manipulation. Jeffrey's rituals grew more elaborate. He purchased tools, chemicals, and equipment with chilling deliberation. He studied the anatomy of his victims, not with the clinical detachment of a scientist, but with an obsessive need to decode the mysteries of control and permanence. The apartment, still and silent, became saturated with the smell of decomposition, masked poorly by incense and cheap air fresheners. Neighbors complained about the foul odors, but Jeffrey explained them away with a disarming, calm spoiled meat, a broken freezer, exotic fish dying in a tank. The excuses were convincing enough to push suspicion aside. What made Jeffrey so terrifying was not only what he did, but how seamlessly he blended into the world around him. He was polite to neighbors, quiet in the hallway, respectful to staff. He paid rent on time. He bought groceries like everyone else. No one imagined that behind his closed door were remains meticulously stored in drawers, skulls arranged like artifacts, and photographs cataloged with a precision that bordered on obsessive artistry. During these months, Jeffrey's life revolved around one unbreakable cycle: hunting, luring, drugging, killing, photographing, dismembering, preserving. Each step filled a different psychological void. The photographs allowed him to revisit the moments of control. The bones served as trophies, symbols of ownership. The remains he preserved in acid-filled containers were experiments attempts to find methods of long-term preservation. But the deeper he descended into this world, the more he lost control of the facade he had maintained for years. He began skipping shifts at work, arriving late or intoxicated, drifting through his hours with a vacant stare. His coworkers noticed the strange smell that clung to his clothes and the exhaustion that weighed down his movements. Yet no one confronted him directly. Jeffrey had perfected the art of disarming suspicion with small talk and politeness. The killings accelerated. His methods became more refined. Each victim became both a person and an ingredient in Jeffrey's delusional pursuit of companionship. One of his most tragic victims was a 14-year-old boy named Conorak Synthesum Phone. Jeffrey lured him to the apartment with promises of money, photographed him, drugged him, and attempted once again to create his living companion. But the boy escaped. He stumbled out into the street, dazed and barely conscious. Neighbors called the police, horrified and desperate for help. What happened next would go down as one of the most catastrophic failures in modern policing. Officers arrived, confronted Jeffrey, and questioned him about the boy. With a chilling calm and rehearsed ease, Jeffrey convinced them that Conorak was his 19-year-old partner, intoxicated after an argument. Despite the neighbors' pleas, despite the boy's visible injuries, the officers believed him. They escorted the child, still dazed, injured, and unable to speak, back into Dahmer's apartment. They unwittingly delivered him straight back into the hands of his killer. It was one of the darkest turning points in this case. The police left, and within minutes, Conorak was murdered. This incident did not merely grant Jeffrey more time, it emboldened him. It confirmed his belief that he was invisible, untouchable, protected by the indifference or incompetence of those who should have intervened. The sense of invincibility fueled the next wave of killings, each one more reckless, yet more meticulously ritualistic than the last. The nightmares inside apartment number 213 reached their apex in 1991. Jeffrey's freezer held human remains. His refrigerator contained organs stored in bags. A large blue barrel filled with acid stood in the corner of the bedroom. Skulls lined cabinets like trophies. Polaroids captured every stage of the killings, posed, documented, preserved with disturbing care. He was living in a museum of his own destruction. But as the rituals intensified, so did the unraveling of his mental state. He drank constantly. He forgot to cover his tracks. He left containers open, tools out in the open, and evidence scattered throughout his apartment. His need for control became so desperate that it made him sloppy, and this sloppiness became the thread that would eventually unravel everything. The killing of a young man named Joseph Bradoft marked one of the final turns in Jeffrey's descent. His apartment reeked so severely that even Jeffrey could not mask the odor. Neighbors were alarmed, but by then, They had grown so accustomed to strange smells coming from his unit that they only complained half-heartedly. Jeffrey's world was collapsing from the inside, and only one more encounter would bring it crashing down entirely. But that collapse would not come from law enforcement, not from neighbors, not from random chance. It would come from one man who managed to walk out of apartment number 213 alive. The moment that would expose the horrors inside Jeffrey Dahmer's home was approaching, and everything he had built, every lie, every ritual, every secret was about to be torn open. Before we continue, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the shocking unraveling of this story. And tell me, do you think the police failure sealed the fate of Dahmer's future victims? Or was his downfall inevitable from the moment he moved into that apartment? The night that would shatter Jeffrey Dahmer's illusion of invincibility began like so many others, with a calculated search for someone he could lure into apartment number 213. By mid-1991, Dahmer was no longer merely hunting. He was spiraling, consumed by a compulsion so overpowering that every hour he spent alone in his apartment dragged him deeper into psychological collapse. His rituals were slipping out of order. His ability to maintain control over his victims was weakening. His apartment, once the silent centerpiece of his dark fantasies, had transformed into a decaying vault of horrors he could no longer fully manage. By this point, the smell was almost unbearable. The chemicals, the human remains, the acid drum, the decomposition, all of it created an odor so suffocating that neighbors complained constantly. But complaints led nowhere, and Jeffrey had become adept at delivering excuses with disturbing calm. Rotten meat, plumbing issues, dead fish, anything to dismiss concern. And it almost always worked. Almost. But by July of that year, Jeffrey was fraying. His drinking intensified. He grew more reckless with his choices. He brought men home in rapid succession, sometimes one after another, struggling to keep track of the remains, the photographs, the tools. He slept among bones and containers as though they were simply part of the furniture. The line between fantasy and reality had dissolved entirely. It was during this steady unraveling that he encountered a man named Tracy Edwards. On the evening of July 22nd, Dahmer found Tracy near a Milwaukee mall. He approached him the same way he had approached many of his previous victims, with quiet confidence, offering money for photographs and a few drinks back at his place. Tracy hesitated. He sized Jeffrey up, studying his odd posture, his distant gaze, the strange mixture of politeness and tension in his voice. Something felt off. Something felt wrong. But poverty, desperation, and the need for quick cash often silence instincts. Tracy accepted. The walk back to Dahmer's apartment was uneventful, yet heavy with unspoken tension. When Tracy crossed the threshold into apartment number 213, the smell hit him immediately. It was thick, chemical, sour, and inexplicable. Jeffrey brushed it off, claiming he had been cleaning and had accidentally spilled chemicals. He moved casually, but Tracy noticed the stiffness in his movements, a fragile mask barely covering a storm beneath his skin. As Tracy scanned the room, he noticed something else. A large blue barrel in the corner, boxes stacked in unnatural arrangements, a power drill resting near the couch, and the walls bare, cold, sterile. Nothing personal, nothing warm, nothing that felt like a home. Then Jeffrey locked the door. What followed was a slow, calculated attempt to gain control. Jeffrey offered Tracy a drink and turned a horror film. When Tracy declined the drink, Jeffrey became agitated. His voice shifted, his demeanor changed, and Tracy realized the danger he was in. Then Jeffrey pulled out a knife. He pressed it against Tracy's ribs, forcing him to sit still. He rested his head on Tracy's chest, listening to his heartbeat with a slow, almost animal hunger. He murmured phrases that made the room feel even colder. "I want to hear your heart. I am going to eat it. It was in these moments that Tracy understood exactly what Jeffrey intended to do. His mind raced, searching for any possibility of escape. Most of Dahmer's victims never made it past this stage. But Tracy did something none of the others had managed. He talked. He stalled. He negotiated. He used calmness as a weapon. He told Jeffrey he was his friend. He told him everything was okay. He told him they could talk, relax, and spend time together. Jeffrey, fractured by paranoia and fantasy, began to sway. His emotional instability became an opening one Tracy exploited with precision. For hours, Tracy played this psychological game, waiting for the one moment when Jeffrey would slip, when fear or exhaustion or alcohol would weaken the predator just long enough. That moment arrived when Jeffrey attempted to handcuff Tracy. Only one cuff clicked shut, locking onto his wrist. The second cuff failed. Jeffrey grew frustrated and distracted, his ritual interrupted, his control slipping. Tracy used that sliver of chaos, asking for the bathroom as a distraction. When Jeffrey looked away, Tracy exploded into motion. He punched Jeffrey in the face, sprinted toward the door, unlocked it, and ran barefoot into the hallway and down the street. He did not stop running. Moments later, he flagged down a police car. The officers noticed the handcuff immediately. Tracy's fear was unmistakable. Shaking, sweating, speaking in broken bursts, he led them toward the apartment he had just escaped. The officers knocked on Dahmer's door. He opened it, stunned, confused, trying to recover his calm mask. He claimed the handcuff was a simple misunderstanding, but the officers asked to step inside. It was over. The police walked in and immediately sensed something was wrong. The smell, the photographs, the tools scattered across the room, nothing made sense. They asked Jeffrey about the key to the handcuffs. He tried to keep the conversation steady, but panic crept into his voice. While one officer confronted Jeffrey, the other wandered toward a partially open drawer. Inside that drawer were Polaroids, dozens of them. Images of dismembered bodies, stages of mutilation, victims photographed in carefully posed positions. They were so graphic, so explicit, that the officer initially could not comprehend what he was looking at. But then the truth hit him. These are real. With those words, Jeffrey Dahmer's world collapsed. He tried to flee, but the officers tackled him to the ground. He fought weakly, as though he already knew the inevitability of this moment. Within minutes, he was handcuffed, the same way he had attempted to restrain his victims and escorted out of apartment number 213. The nightmare inside that apartment was finally exposed. When investigators arrived, they were not prepared for what they would find. The refrigerator held a severed head wrapped carefully inside. In the freezer, they found more remains. In the metal filing cabinet, they uncovered skulls arranged in stacks. The blue barrel contained torsos dissolved in acid. Jars filled with preserved organs lined the bedroom. Tools, chemicals, saws, knives, and bones were scattered everywhere. It was a crime scene unlike anything Milwaukee police had ever encountered, and perhaps unlike anything the nation had witnessed in modern times. Reporters, neighbors, and crowds gathered outside the building, stunned by the flood of information pouring out of police radios. Officers walked out of the building visibly shaken, some unable to hide their horror. One officer later described the scene as a house of death, another as the closest thing to hell on earth. In the days that followed, public outrage grew into a national eruption. People demanded answers. How had he escaped detection for so long? Why had the police returned Konarak to his killer? How had neighbors' complaints been ignored repeatedly? And most importantly, how many lives could have been saved? Jeffrey, sitting in an interrogation room, began confessing almost immediately. He spoke with a calm, clinical tone, recounting each murder in chilling detail. He discussed his fantasies, his rituals, His attempts to create living zombies, his obsession with possession, and his desire for complete control. The detectives, some seasoned veterans with decades of experience, described his accounts as the most disturbing they had ever heard. But behind Jeffrey's soft voice and detailed recollections, something else was dissolving, the last remnants of the illusion he had built. For 13 years, he had managed to deceive neighbors, police, co-workers, and relatives. Now, in the interrogation room, stripped of secrecy, Jeffrey Dahmer faced the reality he had tried to avoid. The world finally saw him for what he was, and the world was horrified. But the darkest revelation was yet to come. Because once the confessions were finished, once the apartment was emptied, once the remains were cataloged, investigators still had one final question. Why? What force had shaped Jeffrey Dahmer into what he became? A predator, a manipulator, an experimenter, a collector of human lives. His answers would disturb the world even more than the photographs. Before we move to the next part, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the chilling psychological unraveling of this story. And tell me, do you believe Dahmer's arrest was fate? Or was it the one narrow window of opportunity created by Tracy's extraordinary escape? The interrogation room where Jeffrey Dahmer sat in late July of 1991 was small, windowless, and suffocatingly quiet. The walls were a pale, indifferent color, the kind used in police stations to keep emotions neutral. But nothing in that room felt neutral. Detectives hovered between shock and disbelief as they listened to Dahmer unravel the truth of what he had done. His voice stayed calm, almost gentle, as though he were describing someone else's life, someone else's horrors. Yet every word came from him, measured, detailed, deliberate. He did not deny anything. Instead, he volunteered it. The detectives barely had to ask. As if relieved to finally release the weight of his secrets, Jeffrey spoke with a strange mixture of resignation and clarity. He recounted each victim in order, naming them, describing where he met them, how he lured them back, what he did to them once the door closed. He explained the rituals, the photographs, the preservation methods. He even described the fantasies behind each act, fantasies rooted in control, possession, and an obsessive need to keep his victims from ever leaving. He admitted to 17 killings. 17. But the number was only part of the horror. What truly disturbed detectives was the consistency, the pattern, the way his methods evolved with chilling precision. Listening to him was like listening to a scientist describe a series of experiments meant to solve an unsolvable equation. And that equation was control. At the heart of Jeffrey Dahmer's compulsions was a deep terror, the fear of being abandoned. He described the loneliness of his childhood, the silence in his home, the emotional distance from his parents, the surgeries, the isolation, the alcoholism, the fantasies that began when he was barely a teenager. He talked about the desire to keep someone with him forever, a desire that mutated into delusion and then into brutality. When detectives asked why he kept pieces of his victims, he answered without hesitation. They made him feel less alone. But as the interviews continued, another disturbing layer emerged. Jeffrey had grown increasingly attached to the idea of creating a compliant companion, someone alive but not truly conscious, someone who could never abandon him. The drilling, the chemicals, the experiments, they were attempts to fulfill this twisted fantasy. Every failure pushed him deeper into madness. Every victim became another step in what he believed was a path toward the perfect solution to his loneliness. Detectives listening to these confessions felt sick. They were seasoned officers, men who had investigated countless crimes. Yet the calm way Jeffrey described his experiments made their skin crawl. He wasn't proud of them, but he wasn't horrified either. He simply stated facts, as though he had accepted long ago that he was no longer part of the same moral world as everyone else. Eventually, the interrogation turned toward the physical evidence found in his apartment. Investigators had spent hours cataloging everything and were still shaken by what they had uncovered. They found bones, some cleaned, some still carrying soft tissue. They found skulls arranged with eerie deliberation. They found a freezer containing organs, wrapped and labeled in plastic. They found the blue barrel filled with decomposing torsos. They found tools, chemicals, photographs, and journals. One detective later described entering that apartment as stepping into a nightmare that you cannot understand, even while standing in the middle of it. Yet Jeffrey understood it perfectly. As days passed, his cooperation continued. He sat in that interrogation room day after day, revealing every detail, answering every question. He never asked for a lawyer. He never tried to minimize his actions. He never attempted to paint himself as insane. Instead, he insisted he knew exactly what he had done and that he bore full responsibility. But that clarity did not erase the brutality of his crimes. If anything, it made them more terrifying. By the time Jeffrey Dahmer was formally charged, the public was already consumed by rage. Newspapers printed his face on front pages. Television reporters stood outside the Oxford apartments day and night. Protesters demanded answers. How had so many opportunities to stop him been missed? How had the police returned a child to his killer? How many lives were lost because warnings and complaints were ignored? The trial was inevitable, but determining how to prosecute him became a national debate. Was he legally insane? Was he suffering from a psychological condition beyond his control? Or was he fully responsible for his actions, his rituals, and the horrors inside his apartment? The prosecution argued that Jeffrey Dahmer was a man who understood right from wrong, who hid his crimes, who lied when necessary, who manipulated others, who planned his actions with precision. They portrayed him as someone in control, not a man consumed by insanity, but a man consumed by obsession and choice. The defense, however, described a man driven by delusions and impulses beyond his comprehension. They argued that no sane mind could commit such acts. They brought in psychiatrists who spoke of disorders, trauma, chemical imbalances, and psychological fractures. And through it all, Jeffrey sat quietly, listening, expressionless. His trial began in early 1992. Families of the victims filled the courtroom. Some wept. Some stared blankly at the man responsible for their sons' deaths. Some could not bring themselves to look at him at all. The tension inside that room was unbearable. The air felt thick with grief, rage, and disbelief. When Jeffrey spoke in court, his voice was quiet. He apologized to the families. He told them he never meant to hurt anyone. He claimed he only wanted companionship, permanence, control. His words were hollow to some, horrifying to others, and deeply unsettling to the nation. After weeks of testimony, expert analyses, and emotional statements from the families, the jury reached a decision. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was found legally sane, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, multiple life terms, one after another, ensuring he would never walk free again. As he was led out of the courtroom, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the families of his victims watched him disappear into the custody of the prison system. The man who had lived undetected for more than a decade was finally caged. But prison would not bring peace. Not for him. Not for the families. Not for the nation that was still reeling from the truth of what he had done. Because inside the prison walls, Jeffrey Dahmer's story was entering its final, unexpected, and brutal chapter. Before we continue to the next part, take a moment to subscribe so you do not miss the conclusion of this story. And tell me, do you believe Jeffrey's calm confessions were genuine remorse, or just another layer of his psychological distortion? Jeffrey Dahmer entered the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, in early 1992. For the first time in over a decade, he was stripped of control. No more locked apartment door, no more silence, no more rituals executed in darkness. But the prison walls did not bring the clarity some expected. Instead, They became the final stage in a life defined by isolation, delusion, and destruction. Inside the prison system, Jeffrey was both infamous and despised. Other inmates knew his crimes intimately. Television reports, newspapers, whispers among guards. There was a hierarchy in prison, and men who preyed on children or committed sexual violence were placed at the very bottom. Jeffrey, having murdered young men, and in one tragic case, a child, was marked from the first day. The administration knew it. He knew it. Everyone did. At first, Jeffrey was placed in protective isolation. He spent his days mostly alone, eating alone, showering alone, walking alone. The isolation was meant to protect him, but to Jeffrey, isolation had always been a double-edged sword, comforting, yet destructive, familiar, yet suffocating. After months of solitude, he requested to be moved into the general population. He claimed he no longer cared what other inmates thought of him. He said he accepted whatever fate awaited him, and the prison eventually granted his request. Inside the general population, Jeffrey developed a strange, contradictory routine. On the surface, he appeared compliant. He attended church groups, spoke with prison chaplains, read religious literature, and even expressed interest in being baptized. Some saw this as remorse. Others saw it as another mask, another attempt to create an internal world where he could control the narrative. But alongside this calm exterior, Jeffrey displayed an unsettling sense of humor that horrified inmates and guards alike. He would shape food into grotesque forms meant to resemble body parts. He created fake blood with ketchup packets, leaving them for guards to find. He joked about cannibalism. He mocked the very crimes that had shattered families forever. Some saw this as a sign of mental deterioration. Others believed it was Jeffrey's way of provoking inmates, daring them to react. His actions drew the attention of a man named Christopher Scarver. Scarver was serving a life sentence for murder. He struggled with severe mental illness and had a reputation for violent delusions that sometimes centered around divine justice. To him, Jeffrey Dahmer was not just another inmate. He was the embodiment of sin, blasphemy, and moral corruption. The jokes, the behavior, the news reports about the horrors of apartment number 213, all of it fed into Scarver's growing fixation. Prison guards noticed tension building around Jeffrey. Inmates whispered threats. Some threw things at him during meals. Others taunted him with memories of his crimes. And through it all, Jeffrey seemed strangely detached, as though he were a spectator in his own downfall. He rarely defended himself. He rarely responded with anger. He simply drifted through the prison corridors, thin, pale, and ghost-like. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer's life met its final turning point. It began as a routine work detail. Jeffrey, fellow inmate Jesse Anderson, and Christopher Scarver were assigned to clean the prison gymnasium and restroom areas. They were left unattended for short intervals, a breach of protocol that would later fuel controversy. Scarver confronted Jeffrey almost immediately. What was said in those moments is partly speculation. Scarver later claimed he confronted Jeffrey with a news article detailing the murders, accusing him of mocking his victims and showing no remorse. Others believe Scarver acted without warning, driven by his own internal voices he had described for years as commanding him to carry out divine justice. Scarver grabbed a metal bar from the gym equipment. The blows came fast, powerful, and unrelenting. Jeffrey Dahmer collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. By the time guards returned, Jeffrey was barely conscious. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, but the injuries were catastrophic. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The news spread across the nation with astonishing speed. For some, it brought closure. For others, it raised new questions. Should the prison have protected him? Was his death justice, or was it a failure of the system? Should a man who had caused so much suffering had been allowed to die at the hands of another inmate? Reactions were divided. Some families of victims felt relief, describing the news as the only peace they had known since losing their sons. Others said his death did nothing to heal the wounds left behind. Activists argued the prison system bore responsibility for failing to prevent the attack. Journalists swarmed the story. Talk shows debated whether justice had been served or denied. The nation wrestled with the moral implications of allowing a man like Dahmer to exist inside a violent system where revenge could flourish unchecked. But perhaps the most haunting reaction came from Jeffrey's own parents. Lionel and Joyce were devastated. Lionel, who had spent years questioning what he could have done differently, now faced the finality of never getting answers. Joyce, who had battled her own mental health struggles for decades, collapsed under the weight of grief. They were not grieving the criminal the world saw. They were grieving the child they had once held, the quiet boy they had failed to understand, the man he had become despite every attempt to redirect him. Jeffrey Dahmer's death closed one chapter, but the questions surrounding his life continued to haunt experts, criminologists, psychologists, and the general public. Why him? Why did his fantasies grow into violence instead of disappearing like fleeting thoughts? Was it trauma? Neglect? Mental illness? Biological predisposition? Social isolation? Some combination of all of these? Or was Jeffrey Dahmer an anomaly, someone whose internal world was always destined to collapse into darkness, regardless of intervention? Psychologists debated for years. Some argued that Dahmer displayed traits consistent with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal disorder, and severe paraphilic disorders. Others believed he fit the profile of a psychopath cold, calculated, detached. But many pointed out his unusual contradictions. He showed emotional yearning, expressed loneliness, sought connection, and even demonstrated guilt late in life. These traits did not align neatly with any single diagnosis. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Jeffrey Dahmer defied categories. He was a man shaped by trauma, yet responsible for unimaginable brutality. A loner who craved companionship. A killer who sought permanence. A monster born from 1,000 fractures, psychological, emotional, and environmental. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about human nature, mental illness, violence, and the systems meant to detect individuals capable of extreme harm. It forces us to question how many opportunities were missed, how many warnings were ignored, how different this story might have been if intervention had come at the right time, from the right person, with the right support. But the most important truth lies in the victims, the 17 men and boys whose lives were stolen. Their names, stories, families, futures, and dreams matter more than the man who took them. In the aftermath of Dahmer's death, families and activists pushed for change-better police training, stronger communication with marginalized communities, improved mental health support, and greater accountability when individuals report suspicious behavior. Because the legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer should never be fascination. It should be a warning, a reminder of the consequences of silence, neglect, and missed opportunities. A call to understand vulnerability not as weakness, but as a signal for intervention. A duty to protect those often ignored or overlooked. Jeffrey Dahmer's story ends in a prison hallway beneath fluorescent lights, with the clang of metal and the shattering of a life built on secrets. But the story of his victims, their lives, their memories, their dignity, continues in the fight to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. And that is the true conclusion to this haunting story.